Alright, YouTube, just a little bit of an announcement here. I got OBS to finally work here. As far as using the microphone for input, obviously the music is off. I know Paradox is pretty good about letting people upload content regarding their games. It helps build popularity, but they don't really like the music apparently to be used because that's like copyrighted by others as well. So I'll be doing some Vic 2 fairly soon. I'm using vanilla. There's one problem with the game file, and I fixed it. There's a rebel modifier in the militancy settings on the game. There's one bracket that's not properly closed, and if you don't edit that by the middle of the game, you'll get completely wiped out by millions of rebels despite literally nothing wrong happening in your country, because it's affixing the Jacobin modifier to everything else. So I'll be going through... Not sure what campaign I'll do first. I'm not going to do like some uncivilized state where you spend the first 70 years of the game basically just dicking around. Maybe pick off a couple chunks of one of your enemies, and that's about all you can do. About the only uncivilized state in the start of the game in vanilla that's capable of doing much is China, and that's only because it happens to be massive with a inexhaustible manpower. I'll probably do a Prussian campaign first, because everyone seems to like Prussia the best. Probably because if you look, Germany's all sorts of fucked up early game. It just doesn't make sense. How did people live that way? How are these people getting by here? It doesn't even make sense, poor Anhalt. I'll do that. I'll probably do a US campaign also. You can technically do a Texas campaign, which would be funny. But you tend to get your shit stomped in by Mexico. It's very difficult to actually not get annexed by them in the first year of the game. Brazil is also a fun state. I've had fun with them. They got a couple cores in Bolivia right about here, and then the top of Paraguay. And as Brazil, as long as you can suppress some of the anarchists and socialists and stuff that might rebel, you can slowly pick off bits of your neighbors. You tend to get more manpower than most of them. You gotta castrate the Venezuelans early game, or else they have a tendency to try to invade you. Bolivia loses power over the Peruvians and Chileans really are more of a threat than the Bolivians, and the Argentinians usually leave you alone. They try to ally with you. It's also fun to play as the Ottomans, actually, because you start off as the sick man of Europe, and you either can really strengthen your position, you can take a huge chunk of Egypt without any infamy, and because you're surrounded on most sides by uncivilized states, you can expand into them fairly easily. Like you can take over all of Persia. If you can do that, you get a decent extra amount of manpower. Quite a bit more land. It makes it more difficult for other states really to bully you around. The more manpower you have, the less likely they are to screw around with you. And they can literally take this whole area of Egypt. Egypt, in 1836 was it looked a little bit different than it does now, I think. It's also fun to play an Italian campaign. Now, a lot of people prefer Sardinia-Piedmont. It has better literacy. I prefer the two Sicilies. Because it has more manpower, and I like to play an aggressive game, generally speaking. We might even get a chance, if I do the Prussian campaign, it only happened to me once, but under the right conditions you can get crowned from a gutter. If you can get Hanover into your sphere very, very quickly. It only happens once in a blue moon, because it relies upon what the British are doing diplomacy-wise. If somebody else is trying to influence them at a high enough level, usually Austria, they may make a tactical error and go after the Austrians that are trying to influence them. And that leaves an opening, if you're lucky, because you're physically connected to them, to get crowned from a gutter when they're released from Britain. In which case, you can form Germany. So Prussia absorbs all these German minors, all the South German states, Bavaria and so forth. It's very rare for that to only happen to me once. And I played like 12 different Prussian campaigns. But I'll probably... assuming that the French don't play an extra aggressive game and really screw with me, I'll probably try to form Super Germany, because then you can absorb literally all of Austria. It's not that difficult, honestly, to form. Once you get the North German Confederation, your literacy and thus your progress in technology is so much higher than that of Austria, that once you end up annexing them, it actually drops your literacy by about 15-20 points. It's actually very funny, because you got some of these North German states that are, in that sense, better off than Prussia. You've got more industry than they do. You've also got a better sort of coastal region, especially if you focus on the Navy, because you can blockade them. They've only got 3 little regions in the ocean here that they have ports on. You can blockade them using nothing more than steamers if your technology is good enough. Playing a Swedish campaign is also pretty fun. You get to spar with the Russians, or you can abandon Finland and just go after the Denmark, basically, and form Scandinavia. In which case you end up with, near 100% literacy by the middle of the 1800s. Japan can be fun as far as uncivilized states. I'll say this. This is just making people aware. I am going to do Vicky 2 videos. I don't like playing as the British Empire. The United Kingdom / British Empire starts off the game. Obviously, they control Ireland. And they control a huge chunk of Canada. and I mean, if you're playing as them, you end up getting all this. You can also take Washington and Oregon if you occupy them. You have Guyana, of course. You have some little areas here. British South Africa, you can consolidate your control over here. You can take Zulu over easily. It's really funny. You end up with most of Australia, New Zealand and so forth. You get some colonial possessions here, little chunks there. You have India, although it's very difficult to absorb all these smaller Indian states. It's exceptionally difficult to get them to actually be fully annexed. Despite that, it's actually, in my opinion, relatively hard to play as the UK. Nobody will attack you, but managing that many colonial possessions all over the map requires you to scroll around constantly. I don't like that. I prefer a more compact state with 1 or 2 larger chunks of colonial land rather than smaller chunks scattered all over. Like there's British South Africa, there's chunks all over the place, so it becomes Sierra Leone and so forth. Up in here, you've got all these Caribbean assets. France has the same problem. They start off with several colonial possessions there. They've got colonial possessions here. They've actually got one little island here, right there, which, by the way, they still control to this day. They've got one little piece of India right there. I think that's Pondicherry. So it can be a little bit difficult to navigate around. France is easier, oddly enough, to play with than the United Kingdom. I like playing as the U.S. too, not just for the Civil War, and I play as the Union. You can win as the South, you just have to dispossess the Yankee troops and get rid of them first, make sure the Southern troops, make sure the South has the railroads, the South has the infrastructure, and sort of destroy the factories of the North right before the war begins. Then they don't have a war machine. You can go in and occupy the areas they're trying to generate troops in, and if you can do that, you can actually win the Civil War fairly easily as the South. But it's not very much fun. I prefer playing a more historical game like you can as the U.S. If you march troops into these empty areas, you colonize them a lot faster. This should allow you to get Washington State, as well as this chunk of Canada, almost right away. As well as this second chunk of Canada here, Oregon, Idaho. You can outflank both Mexico and the UK and get literally every colonial acquisition possible all along here. The Colorado area, Oklahoma, Idaho, what's left of it, Washington State, Oregon, the rest of Canada, Alaska, after the iceberg deal there, Seward's iceberg, and then all of the northern area, the northern territories and the Yukon and so forth. You can actually get them all, but then you end up with a hideous looking blob. It just looks terrible, unless you intend to literally fight 5 or 6 wars with the British to take the rest of Canada over, in which case you're unstoppable. The only way, really, that I'd like to play is the United Kingdom. One time I played as them, and I invaded China. I had an enormous force of steamers just line up and dropped off, God, I think it was like 1 million troops, and very quickly destroyed all of China and took it over. The manpower was enormous, to the point at which I could literally ignore infamy and just do literally whatever I wanted. It didn't even matter at that point if, like, France attacked me, because they get their shit pushed in. It's also pretty fun to play as the Netherlands, honestly. That's one of the other states. If you can win a war with Belgium and take away their land, absorb them over time, and reunify that area, you can become quite powerful. You'll be as powerful as France at that point, generally speaking. Honestly, though, the states that tend to do well have a higher literacy or a higher growth of literacy. That would be Prussia, Sweden, Denmark, the British Empire, France. These states, Netherlands, to a lesser extent Belgium, Austria, some games, Spain and Portugal and the Italian states and the Ottomans not so much, and then also the United States. As well as China. Only rarely does it end up becoming a civilized state. Usually, end of the game, it's still a backwater because the AI doesn't necessarily focus on technologies necessary to advance into a civilized status. If it does, though, it immediately becomes one of the top 3 or 4 world powers. Almost immediately, industry is all over China, rails start going up, their manpower expands even faster, and they really become a force to be reckoned with, especially since they have a tendency to have absorbed chunks of their neighbors. They usually take over a chunk of Burma, sometimes they have Tibet. The British, though, sometimes keep them from becoming civilized by repeatedly destroying them in war. So do the Russians. Russia's an interesting state to play with. With the old files, if you don't close the bracket on the militancy modifier, Russia collapses almost inevitably before 1900. Finland gains its freedom, Ukraine, all of these, Poland sometimes, literally every state that can be generated tends to wildly split off. Russia's economy falls. I've seen Russia become just a civilized nation, not even a secondary power under those rebel modifiers. But with them fixed, Russia has a tendency to actually become more powerful over time. They do stay in the top 8 usually. If anything happens, it's because some other AI has bullied them. Or if I'm playing as Prussia, you can be sure when tank warfare comes around and I'm more advanced than the Russians, I will blitzkrieg them all the way to Moscow. I'll force them to release some of their other states, and then I'll immediately embark probably on bullying France around or something. Super Germany becomes almost unstoppable. It's almost like cheating if you can form it. Like I said, it's not actually that difficult. The difficult part's all the diplomacy. There's a trick, though. If you want to wait an extra 10 years or so before you can start looking towards forming Super Germany, you can form the North German Confederation very, very quickly. The war with Denmark can be over in the first 2 years, along with absorbing Hanover in the years thereafter when the British release it, because they no longer have interest. Then it just becomes a matter of annexing Saxony. And you can literally go to war with Saxony to annex them. The Austrians will attack you because Saxony's in their sphere, and they can do so without infamy. They get a brothers' war option. So you can literally annex Saxony. You can ignore the Austrian troops, annex them, form the North German Confederation. Then your troops, which are basically still fresh from the fight because the Saxony's weak, can be diverted back to Austria. Start sparring with them while forming your new armies from all that new land behind the enemy, behind the line that has formed, usually along Bohemia. Hit and run. Converge all your troops on any one of their smaller stacks that are on your territory, wipe them out, do them one at a time. And it's actually relatively easy to at least get them to white peace. Now you'll have to wait, because you'll have 20 infamy from annexing a civilized state. You have to wait a lot longer. But you've got the North German Confederation, and you were going to have to wait anyway, because then your next move is potentially a war with France for this little tiny triangle that you need to form Super Germany. It's actually not that hard, because there's a fort at, I think it's Saarbrücken, and if you simply death stack all your troops there, the French will crash on you like a wall. They will lose, because they have a tendency not to allow their troops to organize when they mobilize them. They try to come across the border, you've got a fort there and an army not that much smaller than theirs and much better supplied. They get completely wasted. Send forth 5 or 6 of your armies that are better equipped to follow them, to engage that entire death stack again, to drive them ahead further, hopefully wipe out some of the smaller groups that have organized, and then retreat back across the border with them and send your other armies forward to occupy that little triangle. And after 4 or 5 times of this sort of hit and run, retreating and then advancing, your war score usually is high enough to take it. Once you take that, Baden and Württemberg are easy to put in your sphere and maintain. The French will no longer have interest. Austria doesn't actually touch them, so you have an advantage over them. You also get a precious metal source. With Bavaria, it can be a little more difficult because, of course, the Austrians have a border with them, which gives them extra diplomatic leverage. But that doesn't matter ultimately, because you can literally just go to war with Austria and remove them from the sphere with a war. It's not that much infamy, honestly. In fact, you can do that. You can do that before you go to war with France if you really want to. And when you take this chunk of France, there's no infamy there because it's a choir corps. It's a cause for war because they're part of your cultural union. So yeah, I'll be doing some Vicky 2. Probably, like I said, almost certainly I'll start with Prussia. It's a harder state than some, but it's not. Ultimately, it's not that hard, let's face it. Getting the North German Confederation is fairly simple, as long as you're willing to either, again, fight a protracted war with Austria to take them from their sphere, and if you do that, you should definitely grab up Bohemia at the same time. It'll save you trouble. It's the most literate province other than Venetia, and so it really robs them of some of their technology over the long span that you'd be waiting. You know, the roughly 4 years for that infamy to wear off. Over that span of time, they will fall further and further behind, especially with naval forces. If you build steamers and you have naval organization, you'll be able to block them at sea. This drives war score up, it grinds their economy down, and destroying their navy is required to create Super Germany. You have to take care of their navy, otherwise their military score will always be too high for them to fall away from being a power. There's no way to actually achieve your war goal if they're not, because you have to be able to add them to your sphere as a war goal in order to form them in as part of Germany. The only way to do that is if they're not a great power anymore. The first time I tried this, I didn't realize I had to crush their navy. I was like, well, I've occupied the entirety of the Austrian Empire for 2-3 years, and their industry is gone, they have no land forces, rebels are constantly rising, they're obviously running up debt, and yet they're still a great power. What's happening? Then I realized, oh, no, they've still got a navy. It doesn't have any port to land on, but they've still got it. And that kept their military score up too high. I had to lay waste to it. Unfortunately, then it took me quite a while to assemble a naval force necessary to do so. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing. That's about all. Peace.